Overcome University podcast. Today's guest is Miss Kimberly Williams. She's here to tell us about how workplace environment can become toxic and share with us how discrimination in the workplace is a real problem. I can't wait to get into this conversation. Let's go. Hey, Kimberly, how are you doing?
I am great. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you so much for joining me on the Overcome Adversity podcast. We're talking backstage about the significance of the discrimination that takes place in the work atmosphere, in the business atmosphere, and quite profoundly, I did not know that over 60 million workers have experienced this, and that is a humongous number. So, if we can tell us a little bit about your story and about your journey and what took place with you.
Yeah, no, happy to. I've worked in HR for a long time, and I kind of had the good fortune when I started out in this field working around people with very high integrity. And they didn't care how high ranking someone was. If there was an issue at any level of an organization, even if it was someone above their pay grade, they were pretty good about setting that example, about calling these folks in, about having a hard conversation, no matter where it took place in an organization. And then I left there and I went to some smaller organizations where we didn't have that. And so I kind of went through some learnings, we'll call them, or some experiences where I may have been the first person in someone's entire life to really ever come along and say, hey, you can't say these things or do these things. And this is really problematic and this hurts people. And then going through the retaliation and the blowback of some of that, having my job threatened for some of these things and kind of navigating this space that I really hadn't been in before. And then getting into an organization where it happened directly to me. And so here I am, someone who knows all the rules. I know where all the bodies are buried. I am more protected than most. And yet it was happening to me. And and what was really fascinating is as an HR chief, this was someone I reported up to. So this was a chief executive.
Wow.
I couldn't go to HR because I was HR.
Right,
I couldn't even open an investigation because the people who work for me, they can't do this when I'm their boss. So it would look tainted. So I needed help. And there were very few places I could go. And so I did. I went to legal counsel. I went to the board. Everybody knew there was a problem. It was a problem that had gone on for a very long time, had hurt a lot of people, but everybody was scared. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up in this space totally alone where, I'm terrified as a single mother. I'm terrified of losing my job. I'm afraid of all the things folks are normally afraid of when they're stuck in this environment. And that's when I started going online. And it really woke me up to some of these staggering statistics. These national climate surveys are showing tens of millions of people who are bullied at work, mistreated at work, developing serious psychological injury, having trauma, getting PTSD, brain scans showing scars on the brain, like significant things that are taking place for understandable reasons. I mean, when your job is threatened, your whole world is threatened,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's your income.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a direct attack on your ability to pay rent or mortgage, or your kids go to school, if you can even feed them. And so to me, it's extraordinarily painful, serious event that isn't discussed at all. I mean, it's almost like a public health crisis that's ignored. So that was shocking to see how many folks were going through it. And then I started looking through all the advice online, and it's terrible. It's all like, oh, try to figure out the abuser and what will make them not be abusive and
right.
Everything on the victim, like do yoga and go for walks. But it's all like how to just cope, and none of it's like this is wrong, or anything like that. And so as I was documenting, I was kind of trying to figure out my own words for my own situation, and I got through it. I survived it. they did all the bad things that companies normally did, but I did reach a settlement and I was able to move on to a much safer, better place. But ever since then, I've just been keenly aware of the flaws of HR, the flaws of companies, and trying to figure out how to help as many people as possible in this space based on some of that kind of secret HR language and some of the things that are going on out there.
Wow, as you're telling me your story and your experiences, I directly went to a moment in my life where I was working for a company and I reported a mental health issue. And the reason why I say that, because I experienced mental health issues when I served in the military.
Hmm.
And I went to get seen for this issue, notified the company in regards to taking some time off.
Hmm.
And while on FMLA, I lost my job. And
Yeah.
trying to fight for my job and all of those things that came with that, I realized quickly the significance of understanding all of your HR rules and things like that. I noticed that there were some serious ramifications behind that. I noticed if you're not well versed as you're speaking as somebody in that department, that there's loopholes, there's retaliation, and when the aggressor per se has the company backing them and all of these different types of things, or is in a much higher leadership role than you think about those consequences and things like that. Because in my mind, I always felt like they're going to always be right, as in they're in the know, they already know all of these types of information. When it comes to your situation, you're now thinking about, this is occurring to me, I work in this department. Did you, and knowing that you're in that department, did you say, I'm going to try to fix this issue within my department, or did you have to go to a third party to help you fix this situation? That's what I had to do. I had to go through a third party to help either come to a settlement or something of that magnitude, because for me, it felt like I couldn't trust nobody that was working for the company. So I had to do something like that. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I would say you did the correct thing. I think for most folks, you have to take it outside the company walls, because you're spot on. Companies will be dealing with this type of issue all the time, so they know the rules. They have lawyers to help them. The rules are written for them.
Right.
So, they have, and whereas a lot of employees, this may be one or two events in your lifetime. And so, of course, you're not going to be as familiar with this. For me, though, it was a very odd position because in HR, you're the keeper of secrets. It can ruin your career if you are seen as someone who breaks confidences, even
Right.
if it's because of abuse, regardless of the situation. And I've had a lot of people ask me, they're like, "Are you afraid that no one will ever hire you again? Are you afraid that, by talking about this, you ruin your career?" And and so I was kind of stuck in a position where I was trying to move the company forward and,
Mhm.
and get a resolution without going public, which can almost be a point of leverage. And I talk about that with a lot of folks too. How you show up is so significant. Learning some of these HR code words, citing back their own policies, you're whispering to them, like you're communicating so much, and they will always base their actions based on how you show up, how you present, how much of a legal threat or public threat you could potentially be. And so I had to do a lot of inside maneuvering based on my unique case. For other folks, I think going to outside safety is your best bet. I do think it's okay to talk about. I mean, for me, when I left that job, I talked openly about my experience because I didn't want to work for someplace like that again. And so if if I'm telling you I don't want to work in a bullying environment and you got a problem with that, like I don't want to work for you. So
So that's so important, because being bullied is somewhat looked at kind of like from a adolescent age and things like that. And some people do not think that actually goes on within the workplace. And when people in these authority figures know that they have this type of power, they use that to their leverage, knowing that there's rarely any backlash to that. I saw that based on the environment. So I was in an environment where it was predominantly dominated by men. There was
Mhm.
not too many women that was working within that space. if you can, I don't know how much you want to share in regards to your story or what bullying looked like within your workplace and the cause for that, for you to say this was enough and you had to develop that courage to say this is enough and I'm going to make a change about the situation.
Yeah, I love that question. And I think, for me, it was extremely isolating. And to tell you the truth, I don't even know if I found the courage. Like, I love to joke, and I tell the story all the time. Like, when I finally realized no one was going to help me, worse than that, I was experiencing mobbing, and so that happens a lot when you're a complainant and you start talking to folks. They'll almost have a backlash towards you, even though they know what you're saying is true. And a lot of that is like, "Hey, I'm scared. Keep your stuff away from me. Don't drag me to. You're a sinking ship."
Right, right.
And so, yeah, but, and I had people very close to me saying, just shut up, deal with it. Don't risk your job, all the typical things that a lot of people will say. And then I remember, for me, it fundamentally comes down to who am I? And in my HR career, I've always done that. Like, if I'm the only person in the room and I know this is wrong and I know that this is an unpopular point of view and I don't say anything, why am I there? And
Right.
so I'm in this field because I actually feel very protective of people. And I knew if I couldn't stand up for myself in this moment, then how was I going to stand up for anybody else? I couldn't have two separate rules where one existed for the top brass and one existed for everybody else. How was I going to continue firing people for doing the same thing that the boss was doing? None of that sat right with me. So that discomfort kind of rose to a higher degree of pain, or, I was disquieted by that more than I was my fear. But I never really overcame the fear, and I remember the first time I put it in writing, I wrote it at my desk, and I was so afraid, like my hands were shaking, and I knew I was like, I'm gonna get fired as soon as I get. And I actually like left it in draft form, ran out to my car in the parking lot, and as I was driving away, I hit send on my phone. But and I tell people that because I want to normalize it. It is scary, and that's okay, and we can still do it. It doesn't require you to be a superhero or something. Like, there's ways we can find a path to it. So,
So I want to ask you this because you were kicking butt, and I'm thinking about that uh, about myself now too. So
mhm,
I just started with the company, and I kept getting promoted every single year. I was getting promoted. I was getting
mhm,
bonuses. I was getting raises, and all of these different things came with. I was being invited to be with different leadership meetings and things like that. So I was a superstar for
yeah,
this company. No blemishes on my record or anything like that. So I felt like I was valuable to the company. I felt like I've developed this relationship with this company. And then once all of a sudden I became sick and ill, I was ousted and all of these different things. And it really showed me the value I was for a company. It showed me what relationship was really like. And
mhm,
then it also showed me a sign of like, for me, because the company, when I got interviewed and met with the company, they said they were a military friendly company. So being a veteran, I kind of like bought into that.
yeah,
I felt betrayal.
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about either for yourself or some of your experiences that you may have seen within that workspace for an employee, knowing that you're doing your best, you're doing all of these things, and to have something like that just hit you in the face?
Oh, it's incredibly painful. I'm sure it was incredibly painful for you too, just how transactional things can be.
Right.
And I think, there's two kind of takeaways from that. If possible, I think the best time to be networking for a job is when you don't need one. And,
Mm,
there's never any harm in always just building those things out. Not to be like heavily involved, but just, kind of keep those relationships going, because you do never know. And unfortunately, you may come to a place where you need some additional protection, or some route to deliver you to safety. The other thing I think is really critical to look at, I was in Boston this past week, and I was testifying before the Massachusetts House, and I was telling them my story of abuse. And the reason why I was doing that is they are the first state looking at, it's called the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. And I can send you that link. I think it's WPSA.org is a
Uh-huh.
really good website for that bill. And basically it's talking about abuse and, a lot of things like retaliation and things like that that can come up that are very unfair. And the premise is, it is kind of two things. One, it's decoupling things away from protected characteristics. Because a lot of times you can say, hey, you did this because I'm sick, or you did this because of my race, my gender, my ethnicity. It's so hard to improve that, because a lot of times you have to prove that this was intent. And someone could just be a raging jerk to everybody,
Right, right, right.
and that's lawful. And so what is now starting to happen is you're seeing a conversation where someone's like, look, if I work in construction industry and I get hurt on the job, I can file a claim against my employer. But if I'm psychologically tortured, or I'm injured in another way, it is no less relevant. It is equally bad. And there's all these doctors that are coming forward talking about the long-term impacts of PTSD. In fact, the American Psychological Association last year rewrote the definition of PTSD to include the workplace, because it originally came out with veterans, like it took
Right.
like traumatic incidents of war, but they're now recognizing that having your job threatened can feel life threatening, and that is real. And those hold up in court. And so these very exciting, significant laws are coming up. So I encourage as many people as possible to learn about this bill, introduce it in their state. If Massachusetts passes it, it'll become the first state in the country that actually provides an action that employees can take if they are psychologically harmed at work. New York City is also looking at this, and so is Rhode Island.
Oh, that's interesting to understand that now laws and regulations could have an impact on this, where it could be beneficial to future employees or companies, and now they could leverage that. Speaking of that, though, I wanted to ask you, when employees come on board for a company, they usually do not read through the fine prints. They usually do not read through SOPs. They usually do not worry about all of these things. Can you talk a little bit about the importance for an employee that may be listening to this podcast, that when they come on board, how important for them to understand the rules and regulation when it comes to the HR practices?
Yeah, I think it definitely is important, and you're right. Nobody reads these manuals, and I write them, and it's a lot of work, and nobody reads them. But I talk about this. I have something I call the fear not framework, which is how to navigate this space. And one of the best things that you can do when you're starting to experience abuse at work is to just start documenting, keep a log of every little thing that happens. But go look at that handbook, pull that out. It has to be available to you, and find the specific policies that talk about abuse, that talk about their FMLA policy, that talk about how they investigate, because all of them will have this. But if you can go to HR and say, look, I've been injured, here are the specific examples, the times, dates, things that would show up in an investigation, and here's your policy that you were violating, there's a very good chance you'll make the hairs on the back of someone's neck stand up. If you do. And in some states, it can be a breach of contract for a company to say they have a policy that protects employees. So it's not just the rules for you, it's the rules for the company, and they can be held liable if they violate them. So yeah, it's more important than I think people realize.
Wow. So now that you're in this space and you're now an advocate for yourself, for employees, can you talk about the mission and the work that you're on now for yourself and for the company, knowing that you've seen this, you've experienced it, and now you're championing that?
Yeah, I think it feels good to talk about this stuff out loud, like we had kind of talked about backstage. When you go through these awful events, I talk to so many people who, were drowning in shame. Even really strong people I've met saying like they couldn't talk about it for years, not even with like their spouse, and just and so likewise, like when I was up there in Boston, you had over 100 people in there testifying about the horrible things that had happened to them, and they all talked about how they felt vindicated in that moment. They felt seen. They had a public forum to talk about that, and there was something healing there. So I think all of that's very positive. But, you know, for me, I have a core fundamental belief that protecting the employee is protecting the company. It's not just about protecting jerks, and that it's actually in the employer's best interest to
Yeah.
just not be mean to people and just not let abusers do bad things. You'll get more productivity, you'll get more engagement. It's a win from all sides. I also spend a lot of time talking about how HR needs to change. Like,
Yeah.
everybody hates HR. They, there's that's pretty universal. But I think what a lot of folks may not be aware of is in these private chats and all these spaces where I am, there's so many HR folks that are in a lot of pain that they know these things are bad, that they're dealing with sexism because it's predominantly women in this field. They're getting punched down at, they're getting retaliated against, and they're really struggling and hurting trying to figure out how to help people when they know stuff is wrong. And a lot of times decisions can be ripped out of their hands, so they deliver the bad news, but they're not able to influence or shape the process or the outcome. And so I talk a lot about how HR can get its power back, how they can build relationships with the top of an organization. And it doesn't have to be adversarial. It can be like, look, boss, I'm coming to you. There's a serious complaint. This is an opportunity for us to show our values and our integrity, and people will appreciate this. And right now, I'm really lucky that I do have a boss like that, he puts his heart into the company. He really does value the experience that people go through. And a lot of that too, I think he also recognizes that we have a social justice mission that ties to a lot of people in the community. And how can we be effective in the community if we can't be effective in our own house? And so it doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be hard. I think a lot of it was just because it wasn't talked about, we didn't have the words. And so it's okay to mess up. It's okay to get in there and try and figure this out and not get it right and keep trying again. I think it's a worthwhile cause.
I would like your opinion on something that I've been seeing in the business world. So when I worked for various different companies, HR was like the gatekeeper for anything. You saw them coming in and you saw them going out if you was going to get
Yeah.
fired or leaving the company, all of these different things to include all of the training that took place with that. And then once I left working for a company and got into the entrepreneur space, I noticed entrepreneurs started outsourcing HR
Mhm.
services and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about if you're seeing that change, and then is there a pro and a con to outsourcing HR? And I'm asking that as in, like, would that help alleviate or remove some of those things that's tied to the discrimination that takes place for a company that does HR?
Yeah, I think you can outsource it, but I think one of the challenges when it comes to discrimination, if at
Mhm.
the end of the day you're trying to convince a CEO and they're paying you as a contractor or they're paying you as an employee, there's a power imbalance there that can make it challenging for folks to navigate that space. I have heard people have put out the idea of HR reporting to an independent organization outside
Mhm.
organization, so you remove that element, because I do think the laws are going in a good direction. Gen Z is amazing. Like, they're going to speak up if they
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
something.
They are.
They're going to let you know. They're not like my generation where we struggled. And so you've got two ends of the process that are doing really well, but there's almost this black hole between HR and the top of an organization. And I think we need more light, more focus there. So you can pull it outside, but my preference is get rid of administrative work. A lot of AI can, we've gone that direction where we have 90-second onboarding, we have offer letters that are pre-programmed. And so we're grabbing back all these hours of time to do what I call the deeper work of HR. The most important work of HR is getting into these messy spaces, showing up for these hard conversations. I know a lot of DEI work and like culture and engagement. They talk about the fun stuff. Oh, let's have a party and let's talk about these things. And I'm like, no, if there's a bully in my organization, I'm calling you right now. And I have the support of my boss to deal with this right now. That is equally, if not more powerful, to show the other employees that we've got your back, you're protected. We're not going to let anything bad happen to you. We're not going to ignore this kind of stuff. And I think that's where HR's value can now lie.
As you're saying that, I was just thinking, should EEO take over some of these things that HR deal with to the point, or separate them, if you get what I'm saying. So
Mhm.
some of the administrative things, like you're saying, I think I do agree with you, should be streamlined. That
Yeah.
the way we are with technology and AI, some of those could be automated, where we could do away with certain things. And then some things I do think, like when we, let's say we needed to take it to a third party, EEO could come in and actually do some of those things where employees could say, like, I could go directly to this source opposed to knowing that I have to deal with my boss. Because when you have someone like you mentioned earlier that is a doesn't have a side or anything like that and is much more neutral, then
Hmm.
I think you feel much more safer as an employee when it comes to handling issues and dealing with some sensitive topics and things like that that you may be scared to talk to your coworker with or even bring it to your boss.
Yeah, but I mean, you can actually do that right now. So a lot of states have an Office of Civil Rights, and California, where our company is based, they have a really robust. California is kind of funny. Whatever federal law exists, California is going to make another one that's like slightly different. Um, but EEO, I mean, that's a federal office. So anyone, like even Florida, wherever you are, you can file a complaint with EEO, and then they will send a letter to your boss saying, they either need to get an investigation done and respond to this complaint, or they will potentially pick up and open an investigation, give you a right to sue letter. So there can be safety outside of that. And I am a big advocate, like even these changes of laws that we're looking at. My hope is that you don't even need them, but just being able to point to that, and a lot of people can now. One discrimination case can, I think, there was recently a jury award of $366 million in Texas against FedEx for racial discrimination claim involving one individual. And so you're seeing massive awards. So one would think you could go to your boss and say, hey, how about we work this out for free? Or maybe so that
Wow.
we don't have something so destroying as that. And so that it can become a point of leverage to hopefully make everyone's environment better.
So, for the listener that's listening to this podcast that's experiencing discrimination in their workplace, can you talk a little bit about what discrimination would look like from whatever gamut it is? But what are some strategies that they could take right now, or some actions that they could take if they're feeling some sort of discrimination?
Yeah, for me, whether I'm working with an individual in my company or whether I'm worried about experiencing it myself, I immediately start a log, and so I will say, October 17th at 7:46 a.m., I was speaking with Michael, here's who was there, here's what happened, and make it just the facts, ma'am. Like no color, no, this really hurt my feelings, none of that, just very cold hard math, and keep doing it and keep doing it. Um, a lot of folks that I work with, they're really scared after the first moment. So sometimes it takes a few of these, which is okay. Everybody can work at whatever pace they feel safe enough to work in. But it's also my experience that if they do it once and get away with it, they're going to do it again. And so
Right.
just kind of keeping that log there. And then, two, like we talked about before, get those policies together, really look at that. Um, and then step three, which is really, really significant, and also look at your evidence. Like if you're aware of other people who've been impacted, make note of that in your log, because that could become part of a critical investigation that really bolsters your claim. And it's especially important too if you get into like a he said, she said situation, you want to have as many facts as possible. Fortunately, since the pandemic started, so much more stuff is done by text, email, right?
Right.
Investigations almost write themselves now because people
Yeah.
are putting it in writing. So include screenshots of any of that stuff and put all that together in a document. Then write HR or your manager, even if it feels scary to do so, and put all that stuff in writing. Writing is critical. It is so critical because someone who whispers a complaint probably won't move forward. Somebody who puts it in writing, now it's discoverable. So whether you move forward or somebody else does, an attorney goes in there and starts requesting that it can pop up. So it's that will make them sit up straighter when they see that it's in writing. But the way you present will impact how they show up in response. So they're going to be weighing that. They're like, oh my God, that person was calm. They were professional. They cited that we're violating law and our own policies. They had very, like a good list of details. And then they use the words, this is impacting my ability to do my job. Don't add anything else. And that is going to get their attention. So the person who does that versus the person who goes to HR and says, hey, I'm hurting, but I don't want you to do anything. I don't want an investigation. We're talking about extreme differences in outcomes. One is more likely to get very strong action. One may not get any because you're now asking people, even people who have the courage and backbone to have something, we can't just go off of those words alone. None of us want to be able to be fired just because somebody said something bad. Like we have to, so we don't want a system like that. But but I see it when folks come in, and a lot of times in my head, I can't discuss that stuff or it looks tainted. But I'm like, oh, well, this guy, I know this guy. I've heard his name 10 times, but I need you to participate in this investigation. I can't just go out there and do something with nothing. And so sometimes HR really can be on your side, but they have to present as neutral. Otherwise, it looks like they were out to get somebody, and it's not gonna ultimately help.
For that listener that's listening and they're a part of a union, can you talk a little bit about the difference with an employee that's covered by a union? Because you see some of these things take place when they go on strike or they get fired, but they can still come back to their job. Can you talk a little bit about the difference when it comes to that around the HR aspects of things?
Yeah, I mean, some of it will depend on the union itself. Sometimes it also depend on what kind of state you're in. Like
Mhm.
being part of a union in California is probably a lot better than maybe Florida. And so some of it is tied to that. But I would say 100% contact your union rep always. They're extremely knowledgeable about the rules. They have a lot of relationships with folks inside. So sometimes, I mean, like I worked with unions in California quite frequently, and we would have conversations all the time, and so sometimes by having those like good relationships with folks in HR or folks within management, they're able to advocate for you in kind of quiet ways and,
Yeah.
and doing other meetings. And then two, depending on the union itself, some of those dues are going towards legal resources. So they may have funds that could support you if things escalate to that point. But you won't know if you don't ask. So I definitely think it's always wise. You can't lose anything, I think, by telling them.
Absolutely. So before we get ready to wrap up and get out of here, if you can share with our audience, you've experienced the bullying aspects of some of the discrimination things that take place in the workplace. For that listener that's listening, can you share with us if they're currently at their breaking point right now? And you just mentioned some tips of things that they could do, but they're scared, right?
Hmm.
Can you talk a little bit in regards to like how could you empower them right now to with the courage that you did, even if it's walking out to the car and then you hit the send button or whatever it may be? Can you
Yeah.
leave that listener with some words of encouragement of what they could do? Because they know they have this job, they need this job, and I don't want to get fired and all of these types of things. Can you leave some words of encouragement for them?
Absolutely. There's a couple things you can do. It varies from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but a few things top of mind I think are worth looking at. One is workers' comp. Things have changed around psychological injuries since the start of the pandemic. If this is affecting you and making you lose sleep, I've seen people throw up and lose 8 pounds in 4 days. Just if it's really affecting you, call your doctor, get a note from the doctor, get time off if you can take it. Take that FMLA if you're just really at that breaking point. That's a job protection. It's supposed to be, and there can be penalties if there's not. And if you don't have leave, look at a workers' comp claim. If you have a doctor who is saying these are workplace injuries, then you may have a claim that you can pursue. That may become a disability that you can look at through your state. It's going to vary widely. Um,
Mhm.
I also think it's worth reaching out to an attorney at any stage. I work with a lot of what they call plaintiff attorneys. So these are attorneys that represent employees. I find that a lot of the law firms across the US that represent employers are like the big law, big firms, but a lot of attorneys who are in it on for the employees have been through this stuff themselves. They love the David and Goliath fight. They believe that employee rights are civil rights and human rights. And and a lot of them are very happy to talk to you for 15 minutes, 30 minutes and help you shape your case and say, hey, in Northern California or wherever you may be, they will know that lay of the land. They will know like how things work. They will know the local laws best, and they may be able to kind of guide you on some of that. But don't be afraid to reach out for that kind of outside support. And then as you start building up that protection, some people will, workers comp or FMLA their way out and look for another job, start getting those backups so that you feel safer, but definitely put it in writing. Even if you're just like, I just want to get out of here, throw that letter out there before you walk out the door because you could be helping somebody else and you still could have a claim. In certain jurisdictions, you have a lot of time after you leave an organization to file a claim, and in some cases you may be able to say like, look, I had to lose this job or take less money because of this situation.
Mm,
So you still want to document, forward any emails, any evidence to your personal email so you can hold on to that so it's not purged. So any of those things I think are really good places to start.
absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Kim.
Mhm.
So, Kim, if anybody wanted to work with you or book you on their podcast, how could they get a hold of you?
LinkedIn. I live on LinkedIn. Like we talked about before, I'm an old fuddy duddy. I'm not really, um, but I love LinkedIn, and I feel like all this stuff that we talk about is workplace related, so it seems like a good place to be. But yeah, I write a lot about this, or I try and post stories about new laws or lawsuits that have happened, and hopefully things that are helpful to folks. And you can always DM me there.
Absolutely. Well, Kim, it's an honor to have you on the show to come and share your story and your experience of what you've been through. I know a lot of our listeners are listening. It could either be them themselves or they know a family member that has been through it. And I love the last piece that you just said, where someone may have left the job due to that, but was scared to report it and may have moved on, but now they know that, oh, I could go back and actually do something about this and not allow this company or this person to get away with this type of stuff. So I just
Mhm.
want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing your story and these words of encouragement where listeners could take away and just have an impact on their lives or their businesses as well too.
Well, thank you. It was really nice to be here.